Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with one of history's most absurd job descriptions, being accused of witchcraft, not casting spells, not flying on broomsticks, just surviving daily life, while everyone else decided your freckles belonged to Satan. Think of it, being pricked with long needles until someone decided your mole was the devil's signature, watching your cat go from pest control to demonic sidekick in a single rumor, or confessing under torture that you rode a broomstick, when in reality you hadn't even left your bed. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy history told with a little sarcasm and a lot of sleepless irony. If not, well, you're free to accuse me of witchcraft in the comments. And speaking of comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because nothing makes witch trials more fun than knowing you're listening at 3 in the morning while the floor creaks like it has secrets. So, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, or something stronger if you're feeling historically accurate. Let the room grow quiet and settle in, because tonight, we're stepping into a world where silence was deadly, blood was evidence, and superstition ruled every corner of life. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Picture it. Instead of answering emails and doom-scrolling, you're the village's goat customer service line for fevers, toothaches, and goats that won't shut up at night. You've got bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, a mortar and pestle that's seen better days, and neighbors who keep barging in with requests that range from "my child has smallpox" to "my beer tastes weird." Congratulations, you're the medieval equivalent of WebMD, except people actually trust you. For a while, this is a respectable gig. They call you wise woman, cunning folk, midwife, healer. They pay you in eggs and stale bread, sure, but at least they're not yelling at you. Yet here's the catch. The moment something goes wrong, the weather, the cows, a rash on the wrong nobleman's backside, suddenly you're not wise, you're suspicious. Those dried foxgloves on your shelf, clearly poison. That charm you whispered over a broken bone, obviously a satanic jingle. Overnight you've been promoted from local helper to cosmic villain. No pay raise included. See, which didn't start out as a synonym for evil. It was more like the neighborhood title for knows how not to die immediately. You were the one who remembered which mushroom made you see God and which mushroom made you meet him permanently. That should have been job security. Instead, it was evidence. Because if you know which plants heal, maybe you also know which plants kill. And once that thought crosses someone's mind, it's game over for your herbal side hustle. It's absurd when you think about it. If a storm flattened the barley, it wasn't bad luck, it was your fault. Apparently, you'd been moonlighting as a personal meteorologist for Satan, a woman trying to keep babies alive during childbirth. Suspicious. A woman failing to keep babies alive during childbirth. Even more suspicious. In other words, you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. Medieval logic at its finest. And the paranoia spread easily, because no one likes chaos without a culprit. Random illness. Nope, had to be malice. Rotten meat, clearly a curse. Toothache, probably you, hexing the molars for fun. It was less about proof and more about comfort. Blaming you felt easier than admitting the universe just doesn't care. The irony is brutal. People needed you desperately when the cows were calving and the bread kept molding. But the second misfortune outpaced your cures. They lined up to accuse you. Your reputation was a swinging door. Healer one day, witch the next, depending entirely on how many goats keeled over that week. So if you'd been born then, you wouldn't have been cackling over a cauldron, no matter what the cartoons say. You would have been the neighborhood fixer, the one with dirt under your nails and gossip in your ear. Useful, yes, but only until the village decided it needed someone to bleed for their bad luck. And who better than the woman with jars of dried leaves no one else could name? Because that's the first great myth, that witches were sinister outsiders. The truth is nastier. They were insiders. People everyone knew, trusted, and then betrayed the moment things got rough. And from here the stereotype only gets crueler, sharpening into that famous caricature of the wrinkled old hag, scowling at the world from the margins. And so, from healer to scapegoat, you now graduate into the next level of the witching career ladder. The old woman. That's the casting choice society prefers. Apparently, if you've lived long enough to get wrinkles and no longer have a husband around to supervise you, you must be sleeping with demons instead. Forget the fact that you've survived plagues, famines, and childbirths that could kill a horse. Surviving at all is suspicious. It wasn't that only old women were accused. Children were dragged to court, men too. 1 in 4 victims were male, which ruins the Halloween costume market a bit. But the poster child of witchcraft became the widow, with a bent back and a face like crumpled parchment. Why? Because she had the least protection. No husband to defend her, no sons in high office, just a cottage, a cat, and a lifetime of muttering under her breath when neighbors annoyed her. That's all it took to convince people she was brewing storms in the chimney. And the irony here is delicious. Old women had knowledge of plants, births, weathers, gossip, networks, the kind of knowledge that unnerved men in power. So society slapped a mask on them, the hag, the crone, the dangerous loner. That image was cheap, effective, and sticky. Once it set in, every mole was a mark of the devil, every herbal tea a curse, every sigh a whispered hex. Basically, being menopausal was a crime scene. It was also propaganda-friendly. Pamphlets and trial records sketched witches as ugly, wrinkled, toothless, because nothing says guilty like bad dental care. It wasn't about what they'd done, it was about what they looked like. If you looked harmless, you might survive. If you looked like someone's cranky grandmother, you were doomed. The artist's pen did more to spread witch stereotypes than any midnight ritual ever did. Picture yourself then. You're 60, you've buried half your family, your joints ache like rusty hinges, and you just want to be left alone with your goat. But no, every frown you make is witchcraft. Every time you don't join the gossip circle in the marketplace, you're plotting with Satan. Silence is incriminating, age is incriminating, solitude is incriminating. Honestly, you could have saved time and just been born guilty. And that's the twisted heart of it. The stereotype wasn't about real witches, it was about controlling the narrative. By branding the vulnerable as villains, society had a convenient way to explain its own misfortunes. And it worked. The old crone image crawled out of the 16th century and made itself at home in fairy tales, paintings, and modern Halloween decorations. Still here, still ugly, still utterly divorced from the reality of who most of these people were. Because the truth is, a witch didn't need to be ancient, wrinkled, or terrifying. She just needed to be in the wrong place when someone's crops failed, or in the wrong mood when the neighbor's child coughed. Age only made you easier to accuse, and ugliness, well, that was free evidence. After all, no one ever asked a wrinkled face for its side of the story. And so the hag was born, not out of reality, but out of fear, sexism, and some very bad woodcut illustrations. And from here, the story only grows darker, because if people didn't just accuse you of being old and cranky, they went one step further. They insisted you were in league with the devil himself. Oh, there you are, accused of being cranky, wrinkled, and suspiciously fond of your goat. That alone would have been enough. But Europe couldn't just leave it at grumpy old neighbor with herbs. No, that wasn't dramatic enough. Enter stage left, the devil. Suddenly your perfectly ordinary life is rebranded as a satanic internship program. Here's the historical punchline. Most so-called witches in early records never mentioned Satan at all. They talked about charms, blessings, folk remedies. Many were deeply Christian. They muttered prayers, sprinkled holy water, and crossed themselves while they worked. But then along came the theologians and lawyers, men who'd spent too much time reading demonology manuals and not enough time touching grass. They decided every spell, charm, and herbal poultice must be powered by the devil himself. Because of course, who else would care if your neighbor's cow had diarrhea? The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, is the star of this melodrama. Think of it as the How to Ruin Lives for Dummies handbook. It argued with great confidence that women were weak, lustful, and therefore natural pawns of Satan. Convenient, isn't it? Every failed pregnancy, every sudden storm, every spoiled beer, it could all be filed neatly under "she signed a pact with the devil." This was less about evidence, more about making the world feel morally organized. Evil had to come from somewhere, and apparently it came from your kitchen garden. And this devil pact theory was sticky. If you were accused, interrogators didn't ask whether you worked for the devil. They asked how long you'd been on his payroll. Refused to answer. Torture would help you remember. Eventually, everyone confessed to dancing with the devil, signing blood contracts, or kissing his, well, let's just say not his face. And just like that, your perfectly ordinary life as a midwife or herb gatherer was rewritten as a tabloid scandal about midnight orgies with Satan. The irony, again, is impossible to miss. Real folk magic was small and practical. Charms for safe childbirth, spells against spoiled milk, cures for headaches. Things so banal they'd barely trend on social media today. But try telling that to a panel of inquisitors. They weren't interested in your nettle tea recipe. They wanted a grand narrative of cosmic evil, complete with horns and fire. So they manufactured one and stamped it into law. Imagine yourself sitting in a dark interrogation room, half-starved, half-frozen, with a man scribbling furiously on parchment while demanding, "When did you first meet Satan?" And you're thinking, "I've never even been to market after sunset, let alone hell." Doesn't matter. If you protest too much, you're stubborn, clearly a sign of guilt. If you say nothing, you're silent, clearly hiding the truth. If you give in, congratulations, you've just confirmed Europe's worst nightmares. And that's how the devil, who never actually showed up in most villages, became a permanent roommate in every witch trial. You weren't just a cranky neighbor with herbs anymore. You were recast as the devil's secretary, filing complaints against cattle and children in exchange for eternal damnation. And of course, once you've been declared a satanic intern, silence itself becomes suspicious, and torture will make sure it doesn't last long. So you've been accused of signing up for hell's internship program, and now you're sitting in a damp cell, staring at a wall that smells like mold and despair. The interrogators shuffle in with their ink, their needles, and their smug conviction that you've been making small talk with Satan behind the church altar. And here's the problem: no matter what you do, you lose. Stay silent. That's suspicious. Clearly you're hiding something. Speak up. Every word is twisted. "I pray to God" becomes "she worships" backwards at night. "I never met the devil" becomes "she's on a first-name basis with Lucifer." Silence was never neutral. In these courts, it was an admission with extra seasoning, and if you think you could outsmart them with calm logic, forget it. These were not fair trials. This was theater with a predetermined script. They wanted tears, they wanted drama, they wanted you to say yes, because silence made them nervous. A silent woman in court, terrifying. She might be innocent, and innocence was awkward paperwork. Better to torture her until she remembered attending a satanic feast where she definitely didn't eat the chicken because demons don't cook poultry properly. And torture was the great clarifier. There's nothing like being stretched, crushed, or burned to jog the memory. Suddenly, silence dissolves into vivid confessions. Yes, I flew on a broom. Yes, I kissed the devil. Yes, I turned into a cat on Wednesdays. Not because any of it was true, but because silence under pain is impossible. The body always betrays you. The cruel comedy here is that silence itself became a crime. Refuse to name names. You're protecting accomplices. Refuse to explain your dreams. You're hiding dark knowledge. Even fainting during questioning could be spun as refusing to cooperate. Imagine that, passing out from fear or blood loss, and having it counted as a refusal to testify. That's bureaucracy at its most sadistic. And of course, once you did confess, silence didn't save you then either. It just meant your words were locked into parchment, ready to be paraded before the court as divine proof. The silence you broke under duress became the voice that condemned you. The less you said, the more they invented. The more you said, the more they used. So here you are, gagged by the absurdity of the situation. Too much silence is guilt. Too much speech is guilt. The sweet spot, where you're innocent. That doesn't exist. It's almost funny, if you squint at it through the fog of historical cruelty. Witch trials weren't about discovering the truth. They were about confirming a story already written. And silence was just another page to scribble on. But silence wasn't the only twisted piece of evidence. Your body itself became a crime scene. Every scar, mole, or blemish was suspect. Proof, they claimed, that the devil had signed his contract on your skin in ink made of blood. By now you've confessed, or rather, screamed something under torture that looks good on parchment, and the court isn't satisfied. Words aren't enough. They want proof, and nothing says proof like blood. Not the poetic kind, not the bloodline of kings kind. No, just the red stuff that leaks when your skin is poked. Witch hunters had a strange obsession with blood. They believed witches used it in rituals, smeared it on altars, or fed it to their animal familiars. In reality, most of this was gossip layered over folk medicine. Midwives, for instance, dealt with blood constantly. Childbirth, menstruation, miscarriages. Natural, messy biology turned into supernatural horror. A woman who understood female cycles. Suspicious. A woman who helped women survive them. Even more suspicious, because apparently nothing screams Satan quite like knowing how to handle a placenta without fainting. But the real spectacle was the witch's mark test. This was a mole, scar, or birthmark said to be where the devil had suckled his servants. Yes, that's exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Witch hunters would strip the accused, poke every inch of skin with long needles, and watch carefully. If it bled or hurt, you were fine. If it didn't bleed, or you didn't flinch, congratulations, you were guilty. In other words, even having a patch of tough skin was damning evidence. Call it dermatology by paranoia. And blood, or the lack of it, carried symbolic weight. If you bled wrong, it meant Satan owned you. If you didn't bleed at all, it meant Satan had sealed you. You could never win. Imagine being hauled into court because of a birthmark you'd never noticed, only to have a panel of men declare it was a cosmic brand. It was less science, more improv theater performed with sharp objects. The irony writes itself. Real witches, the kind modern neo-pagans imagine with chalices and rituals, might use a drop of blood symbolically, like any culture has in rites of passage. But the women dragged to trial weren't spilling blood to call demons. They were usually just spilling it while trying to stop childbirth from killing another neighbor. Yet that everyday mess was turned into a crime scene. Ordinary fluids became extraordinary evidence, and once the myth of blood took hold, it stuck. You weren't only guilty by words, you were guilty by body. Your skin could betray you, your veins could betray you, even your menstrual cycle could betray you. Blood was no longer life, it was a liability, and every court wanted to see it, because nothing sells a witch panic like a splash of red. But skin and blood weren't the only things under suspicion. If your body was guilty, your companions weren't safe either. Even the animals around you, cats, toads, owls, could be branded as your demonic sidekicks. If blood wasn't enough to condemn you, your skin certainly was. Enter the great obsession of witch hunters, the witch's mark. This could be anything: a mole, a scar, a freckle, even a wrinkle that looked slightly too enthusiastic. Congratulations, your body has just been notarized by Satan without your consent. The logic was simple, if you can call it that. They believed the devil branded his servants like cattle, leaving behind a physical signature. Sometimes it was said to be a teat, where demons or familiars could suck nourishment. Imagine being 60, with sagging skin and the elasticity of stale bread, and having a panel of men point at your body like, "Ah yes, that wrinkle is where Beelzebub drinks." Flattering, really. And because paranoia loves props, witch hunters carried special needles for testing. They'd strip you, tie you down, and poke your skin repeatedly. If you bled or winced, you were safe temporarily. But if the needle slipped into a callus or a numb patch, and you didn't react, that was it. Proof. The devil had kissed you there. You were guilty. Which makes you wonder if Satan had an odd preference for random skin tags. The irony is thick. In an age with no dermatologists, everyday imperfections became cosmic evidence. A birthmark, diabolical. A scar from falling as a child, the devil's autograph. A mole, definitely a nipple for feeding imps. Your skin became a crime scene, a surface for investigators to project their fears onto. Forget privacy. Your body was an open book, and they were very creative readers. Of course, the search for the mark wasn't about discovery, it was about humiliation. Women were examined publicly, stripped, and handled under the guise of justice. It was voyeurism in religious robes, legitimized by law. And once the mark was found, there was no argument you could make. You couldn't exactly explain that your mole was genetic when the judge didn't even believe in germs. And here's the kicker. Once the witch's mark idea caught on, it spread faster than gossip in a tavern. Every blemish, every uneven patch of skin was evidence. The body itself became guilty by default. You didn't need to fly on a broom or summon storms. You just needed to exist in a body that wasn't flawless. Which, last I checked, is everybody. So you stood there, accused not by your actions, not even by your words, but by your skin. And if your body could betray you so easily, what chance did your poor cat or toad have? Because next, the suspicion spreads outward to every creature in your orbit, as if your freckles weren't enough. Now your animals are guilty too. If your body wasn't enough evidence, don't worry, the authorities were more than happy to convict your pets too. Cats, toads, owls, hares. Congratulations, Your household companions just got promoted to demonic co-workers. The word for them was familiars, and they were believed to be little spirit assistants, sent straight from the devil's HR department to help you ruin the harvest. Take your cat, for instance. In reality, she's keeping the grain stores free of mice. But to the witch hunters, that wasn't pest control. It was proof of a satanic alliance. Every purr became a sinister whisper, every scratch a coded message, and heaven forbid your cat actually liked you. Too much affection, and clearly the devil was paying it in dark currency. Too little affection, and, well, even your cat knew you were guilty. Toads were worse. Warty, damp, ugly little things, basically tailor-made for demonology. If you had one near your house, it wasn't just an amphibian. It was a minion of hell, probably carrying curses in its slimy little pockets. And owls, those night birds, forget wisdom. If one hooted near your window, it was a demonic delivery service, dropping omens instead of mice. Even hares, which most people considered dinner, were suddenly supernatural couriers ferrying messages between witches. The absurdity here is hard to overstate. Animals had always been part of European folk culture. Cats guarded food, dogs guarded doors, birds carried symbolism in myths, and hares were so common they practically tripped people in fields. But the moment witch-hunting fever kicked in, every creature turned suspect. It was zoology rewritten by paranoia. And of course, the courts loved it. A familiar wasn't just colorful decoration for the accusation. It doubled as proof of your guilt. Find a black cat near your cottage. Case closed. Spot a toad in your garden. Satan confirmed. In some trials, people were even asked to name their familiars, as if pets had LinkedIn profiles. Confessions under torture produced names like Pyewacket, Vinegar Tom, and Grizzle Greedigit, which is either hilarious or tragic, depending on how you feel about a woman inventing Pikamin names just to stop the pain. The irony bites hard. The very creatures that kept medieval households alive, cats eating vermin, dogs guarding the sheep, became weapons used against their owners. Even your cow could be suspicious if it gave too much milk or not enough. Too generous, enchanted, too stingy, hexed. Basically, you couldn't win, and neither could your livestock. And here's the darker edge. Killing the accused animal was often part of the ritual proof. Cats, dogs, and toads were slaughtered to purge the devil's influence, meaning that not only you but your pets paid the price of superstition. The entire household was criminalized, fur and feathers included. So, if you'd been born then, your fate wouldn't just hinge on your birthmarks. It might depend on whether your cat chose the wrong moment to cross the road. And if that sounds ridiculous, remember, this obsession with animals is also how we ended up with one of the strangest witch myths of all time. The idea that women didn't just have pets, they rode broomsticks through the night sky. Ah yes, the most enduring witch cliché of all. Women zooming through the night on broomsticks like medieval Uber drivers for Satan. But here's the secret. No one in 16th century Europe actually saw an old woman straddle a broom and take off like a low-budget fireworks display. The broomstick myth was stitched together out of a mix of fertility rituals, herbal experiments, and male paranoia with a very active imagination. Start with the fertility angle. In rural communities, women would sometimes ride poles, sticks, or yes, brooms, through fields, jumping and chanting to bless the soil and encourage crops to grow tall. Perfectly ordinary sympathetic magic. Act it out. Hope nature copies. But once witch hunters got hold of that, the story mutated. Forget women play-acting harvest rituals. Now they were flying to Sabbaths, leaving their beds to attend satanic raves in the sky. It's agricultural theater rebranded as demonic aviation. Then there's the pharmacological side. Some ointments used in folk medicine contained plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, all hallucinogenic. Rubbed on the skin, especially on sensitive areas. I'll let your imagination fill in the broomstick part. These could induce visions of floating, flying, or traveling. No surprise that confessions under torture often included "I flew through the air." They weren't lying so much as trying to make sense of a drug trip induced by ointments they may not even have applied themselves. And of course, the church ate it up. Flying witches made for great propaganda. They weren't just bad neighbors anymore. They were globe-trotting agents of chaos. It was terrifying, theatrical, and impossible to disprove. If someone asked, how did she get to the devil's Sabbath? The answer was simple: broomstick. If someone wondered why no one actually saw it happen, Well, obviously it was invisible. A perfect closed loop of paranoia. The irony is that broomsticks themselves were the most boring household tools imaginable. Women used them daily to sweep the mud and straw off cottage floors. They weren't glamorous, they weren't mysterious, they were domestic drudgery carved into wood. And somehow, that drudgery was turned into an international transport service for witches. It's the ultimate insult, turning a cleaning tool into evidence that you've been partying with Satan instead of doing chores. So if you had been alive then, imagine it. You're exhausted from a day of hauling water, cooking gruel, and scolding chickens, and someone points at your broom and says, "Ha ha." Clearly you've been flying to the devil at night. You'd probably want to hit them with it, just to prove a point. Unfortunately, that would only confirm the suspicion. And this is how the humble broom got cursed with centuries of bad PR. A tool of domestic survival transformed into a weaponized stereotype. And once flying witches took root in the imagination, it opened the door to the next grand invention, the infamous Witches' Sabbath, where every tortured confession turned into a travel brochure for Satan's all-night festival. So you've been accused of flying on your broom, and naturally the court wants to know where you went. The answer, apparently, is the Witches' Sabbath, the medieval imagination's equivalent of Coachella, but with more goats, less hygiene, and significantly worse catering. Here's the kicker. These Sabbaths almost never happened. They were courtroom inventions, born out of torture, paranoia, and a clergy obsessed with sexual sin. Under pressure, the accused would confess to gathering at midnight in wild fields or mountaintops, feasting, dancing, and worshipping the devil. Did anyone actually see this? No. Did the courts care? Also no. The supposed details were fantastically lurid. Witches were said to eat unbaptized babies which, for the record, there's zero evidence for, dance naked under the moon and kiss the devil's backside, literally. If you think that sounds more like a frat hazing ritual than real folk magic, you'd be right. But for inquisitors, the Sabbath was the perfect narrative, proof that witchcraft wasn't just one cranky woman muttering over herbs, but an organized conspiracy threatening Christendom itself. A medieval world domination plot, brought to you by people who couldn't even read. The irony, again, is biting. Actual gatherings in rural life were far less exciting. Harvest festivals, fertility rites, maybe some singing and drinking around a bonfire. But once filtered through torture confessions, they became satanic festivals, with guest appearances from demons and the occasional werewolf. It was less anthropology, more pulp fiction for anxious clergy, and people believed it. Pamphlets circulated with woodcuts of naked witches riding goats, banqueting with demons, or dancing in grotesque circles. These images weren't journalistic reporting, they were propaganda. They terrified the literate elite and trickled down into gossip for the illiterate poor. Suddenly, every midnight shadow looked like a Sabbath in progress. Imagine you, an exhausted farmer's wife, trudging to bed after a day of grinding grain, only to be accused the next morning of sneaking out to a satanic rave. You'd laugh if you weren't gagged and chained. But in court, laughter was suspicious too. They wanted drama, and drama meant a Sabbath. So the Sabbath became a cornerstone of witch lore. Witches flying, gathering, plotting, feasting on roasted babies, while demons played the lute. None of it grounded in reality. But once the story took hold, it made accusations even harder to escape. Because how do you prove you didn't attend a party that never existed? And from here, things get even darker. Because if Sabbaths made witches look like a global threat, the next question naturally followed. Who, exactly, was being accused? Which poor souls found themselves dragged into this carnival of paranoia? By now, the myth is solid. Witches flying to Sabbaths, kissing the devil, ruining crops with their sidekick cats. But who exactly got dragged into this mess? Spoiler, it wasn't just the eccentric loners and grumpy grandmothers. Witch hunting was equal opportunity paranoia, though with a very clear preference for women who didn't fit the social script. Most of the accused were women, yes, but not exclusively. Roughly 1 in 4 victims were men. And that alone wrecks the cartoon version. Witches weren't all hags in pointy hats. They were sometimes shepherds, beggars, blacksmiths, or just unlucky enough to be related to someone who annoyed the wrong neighbor. In Iceland, for example, men were accused more often than women because of local beliefs that men, not women, were more likely to wield magical knowledge. Geography mattered, superstition varied, but the end result was the same: torture and trials. Still, women bore the brunt. Widows, midwives, healers, women without husbands, all easy prey. They lacked protection in patriarchal communities and were already considered odd for being outside male control. If you were too outspoken, too solitary, or too poor, you might as well have tattooed future witch trial on your forehead. And if you were too rich, that was suspicious too. Jealous neighbors might whisper that your cows gave too much milk because of a pact with the devil. Class and conflict played a role too. Witch panics often flared during famines, epidemics, or wars. When life turned cruel, people looked for a scapegoat. It's much easier to blame the neighbor's widow for your failed harvest than admit the weather hates you. And accusations were contagious. Once one person was accused, names spilled under torture, dragging entire villages into the fire. Children weren't safe either. Some were accused outright, others forced to testify against parents. Picture being 9 years old, terrified, and told to confess that your mother took you to a Sabbath. Lie, and you save yourself. Tell the truth, that you were asleep, and you risk joining her on the pyre. Childhood trauma, sponsored by superstition. And let's not forget the pettiness. Many accusations started with nothing more than a grudge. A borrowed pot not returned, a quarrel over land, a cow that keeled over. Suddenly your neighbor claims you cursed them, and the courts happily agree. It wasn't about evidence, it was about power. Accusations worked as weapons, and women with the least protection became easy targets. So if you'd lived back then, who would you have been? The widow minding her goats, the midwife blamed for a stillbirth, the farmer whose field outperformed his neighbors. It didn't matter. Everyone was vulnerable, but some were more vulnerable than others. And once accused, your fate was sealed. Because here's the next twist of irony. Not every accused which burned at the stake. Depending on where you lived, the method of execution was different. England, for instance, preferred hanging. On the continent, fire was the big theatrical finish. Either way, you weren't getting out alive. Here's a fun twist for your nightmares. Not every accused which ended her days in a bonfire. The Hollywood version loves the flames, witches shrieking as the crowd cheers, fire crackling like divine applause. But in reality, execution styles varied by region, which makes witch hunting less a unified movement and more a macabre travel guide. Take England, for instance. Forget the pyres. English witches were usually hanged. Rope, gallows, done. Less spectacle, less firewood, and frankly, less expensive. In Scotland though, burning was the fashion, efficient, theatrical, and supposedly better at purifying the soul. On the continent, especially in Germany and France, burning was common to air. It doubled as both punishment and public entertainment. Nothing says Saturday in the square like watching your neighbor become charcoal. And the irony, burning wasn't invented for witches. It was originally a punishment for heretics, people accused of corrupting the faith. Witches got lumped in as a handy extension. Why hang someone quietly when you could stage a cosmic barbecue and remind everyone that God hated fun? But hanging had its own humiliations. In England, accused witches were often hanged after long messy trials full of spectral evidence and gossip. And unlike burning, which at least killed quickly, hanging could go wrong. A rope too short, a drop too shallow. Suddenly you're not dead. You're choking for minutes while the crowd shuffles awkwardly. Divine justice meets bad engineering. And then there were the tests. Before execution, many suspects endured swimming trials, tied up and tossed into a pond. If you floated, guilty. If you sank, innocent, but drowned. A brilliant system, really. Either Satan saved you, or you died proving your innocence. Medieval logic at its cruelest. Execution wasn't just about killing, it was about messaging. A fire in the town square was a sermon in itself, a warning to anyone tempted to mutter over herbs again. A hanging on the gallows road was a signpost. This is what happens if you step out of line. Public death was pedagogy, with smoke or rope as punctuation. So if you had been accused, your fate would depend not just on your neighbor's grudges, but also on your postal code. Wrong village, wrong century, wrong judge, and you'd burn instead of hang, drown instead of swing. Either way, you weren't walking home. And here's the irony to carry us forward. The biggest wave of witch hunting didn't even happen in the dark Middle Ages, as everyone likes to imagine. No, the great pyres and gallows belonged to the so-called Renaissance, when Europe was busy patting itself on the back for rediscovering reason. If you picture witch trials happening in the dark medieval peasants in mud huts, pointing fingers at hags while knights polish their swords, you're about 200 years off. the peak of which persecution wasn't medieval at all, it was Renaissance. Yes, the same era that gave us Michelangelo's ceiling and Shakespeare's plays, also gave us the most efficient system for torturing widows until they confessed to spooning with Satan. Progress, apparently, comes with baggage. Between about 1550 and 1650, Europe went into full panic mode. Thousands of trials, tens of thousands of executions, all during an age that loved to brag about its intellectual flowering. The printing press was churning out books at lightning speed, and what better to print than manuals on how to detect witches? Malleus Maleficarum spread like wildfire, ensuring even the most remote judge had a handy how-to for ruining lives. Demonology became a bestseller. Think of it as the original viral content, only instead of cat videos, it was woodcuts of naked women flying to Sabbaths. And it wasn't just art and pamphlets. Religious upheaval poured gasoline on the fire. Catholics and Protestants were locked in brutal competition, each claiming the other was corrupted by Satan. What better way to prove your side was righteous than by staging a few witch trials to show how committed you were to purity? Witches became pawns in a religious arms race, their deaths just another tally mark in a cosmic scorecard. The irony is brutal. The Renaissance loved to call itself the rebirth of reason, yet some of the most irrational hysteria unfolded in its brightest cities. Universities debated the proper signs of witchcraft with scholarly seriousness. Judges quoted Aristotle while ordering women to be stripped and pricked for devil's marks. Science and superstition danced hand in hand, a duet of progress and paranoia, and ordinary people were swept into it. Villages and towns lived under a constant hum of suspicion. Bad harvest, which sudden illness, which lightning strike, definitely which. The cultural mood made fear into policy, with courts acting more like stages for cosmic drama than places for justice. So, if you'd been born then, you wouldn't have been accused in a foggy medieval swamp. You'd have been accused in a Renaissance town with painted frescoes and humanist scholars quoting Latin while they condemned you. Civilization doesn't mean kindness. Sometimes it just means the paperwork looks prettier while they burn you. And yet the obsession with witches wasn't just about philosophy or theology. It was about everyday superstition, the tiny accidents and misfortunes that people couldn't explain and didn't want to accept. And those, more than lofty debates, fueled the paranoia. So here's the real engine of the witch craze. Not theology, not politics, not even the devil himself. It was everyday superstition, ordinary bad luck dressed up as cosmic conspiracy. Because if your life is fragile, miserable, and ruled by chance, you don't want randomness, you want someone to blame. And who better than the woman with the herb garden and the odd look in her eye? Take cows, for example. If your cow gave sour milk, that wasn't diet, disease, or hygiene. No, it was obviously your neighbor's curse. Beer gone flat. Clearly witchcraft. A child throwing tantrums at night. Definitely enchanted. Imagine being blamed for toddler behavior in a time without sugar withdrawals or ADHD diagnosis. You'd be guilty every day before breakfast. Superstition turned coincidence into evidence. If you muttered at your neighbor after she annoyed you and the next week her pig keeled over, that was enough. Case closed. Never mind that pigs drop dead all the time. The human brain prefers neat stories, and the neatest one was that you'd hexed the animal with your evil glare. It's comforting. In a way, misfortune stops being random when you can pin it on someone else. And it wasn't just animals. Crops, weather, and health were all rolled into the paranoia. A storm that flattened the harvest. Someone called the wind, a plague that tore through the village. A witch had poisoned the wells. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. But instead of accepting that life was cruel, people whispered that midwives were secretly baby killers. The healer who failed to cure a fever wasn't just unlucky. She was malicious. The irony is, many of the accused witches were the same people the community relied on to handle these very problems. They were healers, charmers, midwives, the stopgap against death in a world without doctors or antibiotics. If they succeeded, it was tolerated as folk wisdom. If they failed, it was demonized as sorcery. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The motto of witchcraft, accusations everywhere. Superstition made paranoia scalable. No evidence was too small. A dream of a neighbor's face, a sudden illness, a flickering candle, all admissible. Courts happily accepted spectral visions and gossip as proof. Because in a superstitious culture, I feel like she cursed me, carried the same weight as I saw her steal my cow. Feelings and fears became legal documents. So if you'd lived then, you wouldn't need to dance naked under the moon to be accused. You'd just need to exist in the orbit of someone's bad luck. A spoiled loaf, a miscarriage, a thunderstorm, and suddenly you're public enemy number one. And once superstition held the steering wheel, the courts followed. Which brings us neatly to the real farce. The kinds of evidence that were dragged into trials. Hearsay, dreams, even the way your body floated in water, all perfectly valid proof that you were in league with the devil. Now, let's talk about the courts. If you thought superstition in the streets was bad, wait until you see how it looked in the courtroom. Trials weren't about weighing evidence. They were about confirming suspicions with as much creativity as possible. Forget due process. This was improv theater with legal consequences. Take spectral evidence. Someone could claim they saw your ghostly form pinching them in the night, and that was enough to convict you. You didn't even have to leave your bed. Your spirit did the crime for you. Imagine trying to argue, "Sorry, I was asleep. I promise my astral projection was at home with me." The judge wouldn't laugh. He'd nod gravely, dip his quill, and note it down as proof. Or consider the swimming test. They'd tie your hands and feet, toss you into a pond, and watch. If you floated, guilty, the water rejected you because you'd renounced baptism. If you sank, innocent, but also dead. Either way, the court went home satisfied. It was justice by Catch-22, sponsored by bad physics. Then there was pricking, jabbing your skin with long needles in search of a numb spot. Find a patch that didn't bleed or hurt, and that was the devil's mark. Of course, after being poked dozens of times, anyone would go numb. The test guaranteed its own success. It was less about finding proof and more about inventing it with sharp objects. And don't forget hearsay. Neighbors could stroll in and say, "She looked at me funny once," and suddenly you're Satan's personal intern. Children were brought in as witnesses, pressured to claim their mother dragged them to Sabbaths. Dreams were admitted as testimony. Think about that. Someone's nightmare counted as hard evidence. You could be executed because your neighbor ate bad stew, dreamt of you, and told the judge about it in the morning. The entire system was designed so you couldn't win. Confess, and you proved the court right. Refuse, and silence was guilt. Float, guilty. Sink, guilty but wet. The only real choice was how theatrical you wanted your downfall to be. And it wasn't only about fear. Trials were expensive. Judges, scribes, guards, they all had to be paid. Guess who footed the bill? You, the accused. If you didn't have enough assets, your property could be seized. Witch trials weren't just paranoia, they were a business model. The more witches convicted, the more income for the court, just as a financial scam. So if you'd been there, the odds were against you the moment your name was whispered. Your body, your dreams, your neighbor's grudges, all of it could be used against you in a court that wanted only one outcome. And yet, even this madness eventually burned itself out. Not because people suddenly got kinder, but because skeptics started pointing out how ridiculous it all was. Which brings us to the decline, when Enlightenment thinkers and legal reforms finally put the brakes on Europe's witch-hunting frenzy. So after centuries of paranoia, torture, and the occasional watery swimming lesson gone wrong, Europe finally started to sober up. Not because anyone suddenly discovered empathy, but because witch-hunting was becoming embarrassingly inefficient. You can only blame so many droughts and dead cows on the devil before people start asking whether, maybe, just maybe, the weather has its own agenda. By the late 17th century, cracks appeared in the hysteria. Lawyers and judges began to point out that spectral evidence and dream testimonies were flimsy at best. Physicians quietly reminded people that epilepsy wasn't demonic possession. It was a medical condition. Enlightenment thinkers like Reginald Scott in England openly mocked the absurdities of witch trials, calling them superstition dressed up in robes. In short, reason was finally elbowing its way into the room, muttering, "Are we really still doing this?" And money played its part. Trials were expensive, executions disruptive, and constant witch-hunting drained local economies. Even towns that loved a good spectacle realized that bankrupting themselves over accusations of flying goats wasn't sustainable. Rulers started stepping in, not to protect the accused, but to protect their treasuries. Rationality by budget cut. Public opinion shifted to, after too many false accusations, too many scandals, and too many corpses, communities began to hesitate. If your neighbor's wife was accused, maybe next time it would be yours. skepticism became self-preservation. And so, slowly, the trials dwindled. By the 18th century, most courts had abandoned witchcraft cases entirely. The very same societies that once saw witches as the devil's foot soldiers began treating them as folklore, curiosities, or local legends. The witch went from courtroom criminal to fairy tale villain in just a few generations, from execution stage to bedtime story. But here's the irony that lingers: the myths never really died. We still imagine witches as hags on broomsticks, cackling under the moon, when the truth was far messier and far sadder. They weren't villains plotting in the shadows. They were often ordinary people caught in nets of fear, superstition, and power. And history turned them into symbols of evil long after their ashes cooled. So if you had lived then, your story wouldn't have been about casting spells or flying through the night sky. It would have been about surviving a world where bad luck always needed a culprit, and silence itself could get you killed. And when the bonfires finally burned out and the gallows stood empty, you wouldn't be remembered as who you were: healer, neighbor, mother, midwife. You'd be remembered as the thing society feared most: a witch. In most small-scale societies, misfortune never arrived alone. A child died suddenly, a harvest failed, a hunter broke his leg in the forest, and the explanation could never simply be bad luck. Chance was too uncomfortably random. It needed a face. Misfortune always had fingerprints, and more often than not, those prints were female. The logic was tragically straightforward. Illness didn't just happen. Someone made it happen. If the millet rotted in its baskets, clearly it had been cursed. If a young man fell ill before his marriage, then jealousy had poisoned his blood. People searched for culprits, not in the clouds or the soil, but in their own community. And women with reputations for being different, too sharp, too solitary, too knowledgeable, fit the bill perfectly. The label of which operated less like a supernatural job title and more like a social filing system. It sorted out who could be blamed, who could be expelled, who could absorb the unbearable chaos of life. Misfortune was dangerous precisely because it was invisible, and witchcraft made it visible. When the goat stopped giving milk, you didn't argue about disease. You whispered about the woman who had once scowled at their owner. The accusation gave structure to suffering, even if it cost someone her place in the community. And it was never entirely random. Misfortune acted like a spark, but the dry tinder was always there. Simmering rivalries, property disputes, tensions over marriage, jealousies that had been rehearsed in whispers long before the storm arrived. The accusation didn't appear out of nowhere. It was primed and waiting, just needing the right excuse to burst into the open. Thus, a fever or a famine could redraw the social map overnight. One woman became the convenient explanation for everything no one wanted to accept as chance. And once suspicion attached itself, it clung, turning ordinary gestures, a muttered prayer, an odd look, a refusal to share food into evidence. The misfortune was explained, order restored, but only at the price of someone else's ruin. And ruin, as it happened, almost always settled on women least able to defend themselves, which is where the story twists toward gender. The net of suspicion didn't fall evenly across a community. Men might be accused now and then, but women bore the brunt, not because they were more likely to hex goats or ruin crops, but because they were easier to strip of protection. A widow without sons stood exposed. A woman past childbearing years, no longer producing heirs or milk, was seen as socially redundant, and redundancy always made a convenient scapegoat. The unmarried, the barren, the outspoken, anyone who stepped outside the neat roles of wife, mother, or obedient daughter, risked becoming the village's cautionary tale. Age, infertility, or simple solitude was enough to rebrand a life as dangerous. There was a bleak efficiency in this. Communities relied heavily on women's labor for planting, grinding, weaving, child-rearing, But once a woman slipped outside the channels of usefulness, suspicion pooled around her like stagnant water. Those who didn't fit into the reproductive script were reimagined as actively harmful, as if failing to serve meant serving someone else, the spirits, the ancestors, the devil, depending on the cultural vocabulary at hand. The cruel irony was that wisdom, too, could backfire. A woman with knowledge of herbs, healing, or ritual had power that couldn't be easily supervised by men. And power that couldn't be supervised was power that frightened. The very skills that once kept babies alive or eased a neighbor's fever might later be twisted into evidence that she could just as easily make babies die or neighbors waste away. The vulnerable were trapped in this double bind. Too little influence, and you were expendable. Too much, and you were threatening. Either way, you were an easy candidate for banishment when the village needed to purge its fear. And fear, of course, rarely needed more than a small spark, often a petty quarrel, a debt unpaid, or a neighbor's envy, to flare into an accusation. Accusations of witchcraft didn't float out of the sky. They usually crawled out of disputes that had been festering in the mud for years. A quarrel over grazing rights, an argument about whose field belonged where, a pot borrowed and never returned. All these could ripen into charges of sorcery when the timing was right. Gossip was the real accelerant. One sharp tongue could do more damage than any ritual. A woman who snapped at her neighbor, who muttered under her breath when cheated, suddenly found her words repeated with extra seasoning. That curse she never said became the curse everyone remembered. Once suspicion had entered the rumor mill, it was like a bad song, endlessly repeated, impossible to silence, and eventually believed. Jealousy played its part too. A woman with slightly healthier children, a slightly better harvest, or even a cow that gave more milk could attract resentment. Good fortune was suspicious when others were struggling. If you thrived while others failed, clearly you were stealing luck, bending unseen forces in your favor. Prosperity didn't always protect. Sometimes it painted a target, and once an accusation stuck, it didn't stay personal. It spread through kinship lines and alliances, inflaming old grudges and giving enemies the perfect excuse to move against you. Trials weren't just about sorcery. They were about settling scores under the guise of morality. Calling someone a witch was less a spiritual insight and more a political maneuver with supernatural packaging. So every squabble and rivalry carried a shadow. The woman who won the argument might also lose the war, her victory rewritten as evidence of unnatural power. She hadn't outsmarted her neighbor, she had enchanted him. She hadn't been lucky, she had stolen luck. And the evidence for this theft was as fragile as the accusation itself: dreams, strange behavior, or the unfortunate misplacement of a birthmark. Once suspicion began to circle, proof was easy to invent. A mole on the cheek, a scar on the back, a limp in the walk, all of it could be called a sign of hidden powers. The body became a ledger, and every blemish was read as a signature from something unholy. Dreams made excellent evidence too. If someone dreamt of a woman's face the night before a child fell ill, that was enough. The dream wasn't just coincidence, it was testimony from the invisible world. Strange behavior carried equal weight. A woman who muttered while grinding grain, who avoided crowds, who stayed silent too long in a dispute. Each small deviation from the expected could be reinterpreted as witchcraft. Ordinary eccentricity was dangerous currency. Animals made the case even stronger. A bird landing on the roof, a dog following too closely, a cat curling itself in someone's lap. These weren't just animals, they were accomplices. In some cultures, owls and bats were practically indictments by themselves. If you had the bad luck of being fond of them, your trial was already half written. The methods of uncovering these proofs varied. Some groups used divination, throwing bones or reading entrails, to confirm suspicions. Others relied on public ordeals, making the accused touch hot iron, drink a bitter potion, or endure the sharp end of a spear. If she survived unharmed, then paradoxically, it was proof of supernatural protection. If she suffered, well, clearly the spirits were punishing her guilt. Either way, the logic closed like a trap, and so, evidence piled up in absurd layers. A scar, a bird, a dream, an accident, none of it verifiable, all of it deadly. The accusation was never about what could be proven, but about what the community already needed to believe. And to make that belief stick, rituals of accusation had to be performed publicly, ceremonies that transformed rumor into judgment, and judgment into exile. Once the whispers had gathered enough weight, the community needed to make it official. Witchcraft wasn't just a private suspicion. It had to be staged, confirmed, ritualized. The accusation became theater, and the accused woman was forced to play her part, whether she liked it or not. In many places, the ordeal was the centerpiece. Fire, water, or poison, all were considered impartial judges. A woman might be told to plunge her hand into boiling water, the burns inspected afterwards for signs. Another might be forced to swallow a bitter root or poisonous drink, her survival interpreted as proof of sorcery. The water test was especially popular. If she sank, she was innocent but drowned. If she floated, guilty and dragged out for punishment. Justice, apparently, worked best when it guaranteed a headline either way. Divination offered more spectacle. A shaman or elder might cast bones, read ashes, or watch the flight of birds to decide a woman's fate. The randomness of nature was dressed up as revelation, giving the verdict an air of inevitability. The crowd got their answer, the authorities got their performance, and the accused got nothing except shame. And shame was the real point. Rituals of accusation weren't about discovering truth. They were about reminding the community who was safe and who wasn't, by making the accused endure humiliation in front of everyone, stripped, tested, shouted at the group, reaffirmed its cohesion. Fear became glue, and the woman branded as witch became the warning label. This is what happens if you fall outside the circle. The rituals could be elaborate, full of chants, dances, and pronouncements. Or they could be brutally simple, a spear pressed against the skin, a question shouted, a trembling silence that sealed the verdict. Either way, the process was never neutral. It was designed to make escape impossible, to transform suspicion into communal certainty. And once the verdict was delivered, it wasn't just about pointing a finger. It was about what came next, how the community reinforced itself by cutting out the supposed source of danger. Accusation led to action, and action meant control. Which is why the branding of witches was never just about belief. It was about power, fear, and the mechanisms of keeping everyone in line. The accusation wasn't just about one woman, it was about everyone else watching. By branding her as a witch, the community turned fear into a public utility, a way of policing its own borders. Her disgrace became everyone else's reassurance. Order restored, danger named, balance reaffirmed. It worked like a warning sign nailed to the edge of the village. Behave, conform, don't step too far out of line, or the same could happen to you. Every banishment, every ritual humiliation was a social lesson wrapped in terror. The community bonded through its fear of the outsider, and the outsider was often someone who only yesterday had been part of the inner circle. The irony was thick. A woman might have been indispensable as a midwife, healer, or food provider, but once labeled a witch, she became the negative example that made everyone else feel secure. Her removal wasn't just a loss, it was an act of purification. The group could point to her and say, "See, we've dealt with the problem. The gods, spirits, or ancestors must be satisfied now." And of course, fear is contagious. Once one woman was branded, suspicion spread like smoke. Who had spoken to her last? Who had shared her food? Who had helped her grind millet? Association itself became dangerous, and people scrambled to distance themselves, denouncing before they could be denounced. In this way, witchcraft accusations functioned less as justice and more as crowd control. They reminded everyone where power sat, whose voices carried authority, and what behaviors would not be tolerated. Fear was a leash, and the branding of a witch kept the whole pack in line. But fear alone didn't carry the verdict. It had to be sanctified, dressed in ritual legitimacy, and that role often fell to the spiritual specialists, the shamans, healers, or diviners who could turn suspicion into cosmic confirmation. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. Someone had to translate fear into certainty. That someone was usually the village's spiritual specialist, the healer, the diviner, the shaman. Ironically, the very people who trafficked in invisible forces were the ones licensed to decide who else might be doing the same without permission. These specialists held the monopoly on interpretation. If bones were cast, it was their eyes that read the cracks. If dreams were recounted, it was their tongue that wove meaning into the images. They were both judge and interpreter, turning coincidence into proof and rumor into verdict. Their authority made the accusation stick, because it wasn't just one neighbor hating another, it was the spirits themselves, apparently, pointing the finger. Of course, their position was delicate. Being too close to the invisible world made them look suspicious as well, but that risk was the price of power. The line between healer and witch was razor thin, and one misstep could flip the title. Perhaps that's why so many were careful to keep the role of accuser rather than accused. Better to be the one naming the witches than to be named as one. And there was often a political element. A shaman or healer who confirmed a witch accusation wasn't just keeping the spiritual balance. They were securing their own relevance. Every branded woman proved the community still needed a specialist to mediate between fear and safety. The accusation reinforced not only social order but also professional authority. In this way, witch branding was less about detecting supernatural crime and more about maintaining hierarchy. The accused lost status, the accuser gained it, and the spiritual specialist cemented their place as the indispensable middleman in a world of uncertainty. But verdicts never stopped at the naming. Once the spirits had spoken through the specialist, the community still had to decide what to do with the accused, and that's where the sharp edge of banishment entered. Once a woman was branded as a witch, the community had to deal with her, and by deal, they usually meant remove. Witchcraft accusations rarely ended with a slap on the wrist. They ended with exile, violence, or the kind of banishment that was really just a slow-motion execution. Banishment was common because it looked merciful while still being lethal. A woman driven out of her village was stripped of food, protection, and kinship ties. Alone in the wilderness, survival was nearly impossible. Predators, hunger, or rival groups usually finished what the accusation had begun. The community could pat itself on the back for not spilling blood, even as the sentence quietly ensured the same result. In other cases, punishment was far more direct. Some groups beat the accused publicly, believing pain would purge the evil forces from her body. Others resorted to execution, usually by fire, strangulation, or blunt force. Each method carried symbolic weight. Burning cleansed impurity, strangling silenced dangerous words, beating forced the body to yield what it supposedly concealed. And yet, in every case, the punishment said more about the community than the accused. Branding a woman as a witch and casting her out wasn't about correcting her behavior. It was about making an example. The spectacle mattered. The village needed to see danger removed in order to believe order had been restored. But exile and execution weren't only punishments, they were also tools of memory. A banished woman lingered as a story, a cautionary tale whispered to daughters and repeated during disputes. Her absence was kept alive as a reminder. Step carefully, or you too could find yourself on the wrong side of suspicion. Which raises the question, who was most likely to find themselves on that wrong side? Patterns emerge if you look closely, and they revealed that some women were far more vulnerable than others. Not all women were equally likely to end up branded as witches. Some walked closer to the edge of suspicion than others, simply because of who they were or how they lived. Patterns emerged across cultures, and they were rarely flattering to the way societies treated women. Widows, for instance, were prime candidates. Without a husband's protection, they stood exposed, their independence recast as dangerous autonomy. A woman managing her own land or food stores could easily be accused of hoarding power that ought to be shared. What was once simple survival became, under the wrong eyes, evidence of unnatural influence. Healers faced a similar paradox. The woman who knew herbs, midwifery, or charms was often invaluable in daily life. But let a child die despite her remedies, or an illness linger longer than expected, and her skill turned into suspicion. The same knowledge that once saved lives could be reframed as the tool of the devil or malevolent spirits. And since no healer could guarantee success, failure was the perfect excuse to turn gratitude into accusation. Outspoken women, the ones who argued, questioned, or held grudges, were another high-risk category. Societies that demanded silence and compliance from women found rebellion intolerable. A sharp tongue could be recast as a curse. A refusal to obey as a pact with darkness. Those who disturbed the fragile peace of submission made themselves obvious scapegoats. Even age played its role. Older women, with wrinkled faces and bodies that bore the scars of long life, were often treated as uncanny. A bent spine or cloudy eyes could be read as signs of otherworldly dealings. Meanwhile, younger women who rejected suitors or bore misfortune, miscarriages, infertility, or illness could just as easily be branded. In other words, any deviation from the narrow ideal of wife, mother, and servant risked becoming a witch-shaped accusation. These vulnerabilities weren't random. They reflected how communities managed control, punishing independence, silencing dissent, and transforming tragedy into blame. Once you see the pattern, the witch doesn't look like an outsider at all. She looks like the woman who dared to live slightly outside her assigned role. And those roles weren't just enforced by men. Sometimes the most vocal accusers were other women, mothers, sisters, neighbors, who had as much to gain from enforcing the rules as the men did. Which leads to the unsettling truth that witch branding wasn't only a story of male power over women, but also of women caught in the machinery of enforcing fear against their own. It would be convenient to imagine witch branding as a simple story of men accusing women, but the reality was rarely that clean. Often the loudest voices shouting which came from other women, sisters, neighbors, mothers-in-law, all could turn suspicion into a weapon. And nothing sharpened that blade more than envy, rivalry, or old grudges. In households where resources were scarce, competition was inevitable. Two co-wives in a polygynous marriage might find themselves pitted against each other, each accused of sabotaging the other's fertility or bewitching her children. The accusation carried more than fear. It carried strategy. To call someone a witch was to remove a rival, to tilt the balance of inheritance, affection, or security in one's favor. Even kinship ties were no shield. A daughter-in-law might accuse her husband's mother to secure control over land or food. A mother might denounce her own daughter to protect younger children, or to avoid suspicion falling on herself. Loyalty was fragile when survival was at stake, and the accusation of witchcraft was a convenient, socially sanctioned form of betrayal. And the irony is that women knew exactly how vulnerable they were to this charge. They understood that the same independence, knowledge, or sharp tongue that made them useful also made them risky. By accusing another, they deflected danger from themselves. Witch branding became a kind of survival tactic, passed from woman to woman like an inherited curse. Of course, this didn't make the fear any less real. Those who joined the chorus of accusation were just as terrified of being accused themselves. Enforcing the rules gave a fleeting sense of safety until the day suspicion turned inward. And in some cases, that suspicion did turn inward. Communities didn't just accuse individual women, they sometimes targeted entire family lines, treating misfortune as hereditary and branding multiple generations with the same shadow. Accusations didn't always vanish with the body of the accused. Sometimes they stuck like tar, coating entire family lines. A woman branded as a witch left her children marked. Her grandchildren watched with suspicion. Her kin whispered about for decades. Misfortune became hereditary. If a goat died, if a crop failed, if a baby didn't survive the night, the community didn't look at chance, they looked at bloodlines. Of course it happened. Her grandmother was a witch. This generational stigma was its own kind of exile. Families carried invisible scars, even if no new accusations were made. People married less willingly into their lines, shared food less openly, and trusted them less in rituals or trade. The community could forget many things, wars, famines, even who stole whose pig, but the memory of a branded witch was surprisingly durable. It outlived the woman herself. And so, the label of witch wasn't really about the supernatural at all. It was about building fences between women and power, between individuals and their communities, between families and the rest of society. Once someone had been branded, she ceased being a person and became a story, one told in lowered voices and nervous laughter, recycled to remind the next generation of the risks of standing out. The irony, of course, is that almost every society had its witches. Different names, different rituals, same anxieties. People everywhere looked for someone to blame when the world spun off balance. And more often than not, it was a woman. Not because she flew at night, not because she spoke with the devil, but because she was inconvenient, unlucky, or simply alive in the wrong way at the wrong time. In the end, witch branding wasn't about magic, it was about control, about silencing, disciplining, and reminding everyone of their place in a fragile social order. And maybe that's the strangest part, that entire systems of fear and punishment grew out of the simple, enduring habit of turning human misfortune into human scapegoats. The story doesn't need firewood, broomsticks, or midnight covens to be chilling. It only needs a village, a whisper, and a woman who forgot that survival sometimes depended less on innocence than on silence. Every society has its professional gambler with the unseen. The shaman was that figure, part healer, part priest, part village psychologist, and, if we're being honest, part theater. One day they were the lifeline between a family and a dying child. The next they were muttering over bones and feathers in the corner, and nobody could tell if they were communing with the ancestors or just stalling for dramatic effect. The role itself was slippery by design. Shamans didn't just memorize herbs or chants. They were supposed to climb invisible ladders into other worlds, bargain with spirits, and drag back health, luck, or rain. A dangerous job description if ever there was one. After all, the same hand that could stir a healing decoction of roots could also, with very little imagination, stir up poison. And if a shaman had the ear of the spirits, who was to say they weren't occasionally whispering something nasty back? Communities treated them with a mixture of devotion and paranoia. Gifts were offered: tobacco, meat, beads, even the occasional goat, not just out of gratitude but as insurance. Better to overpay the person who knows the language of invisible forces than risk offending them. But every blessing carried the shadow of a curse. If your crop suddenly failed after you forgot to bring the shaman his share, well, who else could you blame? The rain spirits. Easier to point to the man in feathers who already claimed he was pulling strings in the sky. It didn't help that shamans often cultivated an aura of deliberate eccentricity. They wore strange costumes, spoke in riddles, and staged performances in trance. To the outsider, it looked like theater. To the insider, it looked like sorcery waiting for a slip-up. One misplaced ritual, one illness that lingered too long, and suspicion fermented. Anthropologists like Mircea Eliade noted that shamanic power was always ambiguous. Healing and harming were two sides of the same drumbeat. Among the Owenki of Siberia, for instance, shamans were expected to protect hunters from malevolent spirits, but were also feared for their ability to curse rivals. Among the Inuit, the line between a spirit helper and a spirit weapon was razor thin. Shamans might call sea animals into nets, but just as easily be accused of sinking boats with a muttered chant. The very authority that secured their place in the village also guaranteed that their downfall was just one famine, one mysterious death, or one jealous rival away. And therein lay the irony. The community couldn't function without them, but it also couldn't entirely trust them. The shaman was indispensable, but never safe. Loved, but watched. A paradox with a drum and a bone rattle. It is no surprise then that when disasters rolled through, plagues, droughts, wars, the same people who once cheered their shamans while dancing were suddenly the first to whisper about dark magic. Because if you've spent years convincing everyone you speak to spirits, don't act surprised when they accused you of giving those spirits the wrong orders. And that's where the trouble always began. The day healing stopped working, and misfortune arrived with a ready-made suspect already living at the edge of the village. Nothing erodes trust faster than a sick child who doesn't recover. In the fragile economies of small communities, where food shortages or an unexpected fever could thin the population overnight, shamans were called in as the last defense. They rattled drums, sucked at wounds, spat out pebbles supposedly drawn from the body, and whispered incantations meant to stitch the soul back into place. When it worked, the shaman was a miracle worker. When it didn't, well, then came the whispers. Illness was rarely seen as random. To most societies, misfortune had intent. A cough that turned into pneumonia wasn't just an infection, it was someone's doing. Death didn't come knocking alone, it was sent. And the person who lived their life insisting they had special control over spirits was the obvious suspect when control seemed to falter. Take the Azande of Central Africa, studied by E. Evans Pritchard for them. Witchcraft wasn't an abstract belief, but a daily explanation. Termites may have weakened a granary, but if it collapsed on your head, it was witchcraft that timed the accident. In similar ways, a failed healing was rarely just bad luck. The shaman who couldn't fix the problem became the problem. Across Siberia, among the Yakut shamans who lost too many patients were accused of deliberately redirecting their power. Healing and harming were imagined as the same craft, differing only in intent. And if a shaman couldn't cure your child, maybe it was because he had already sold the cure to someone else, or worse, because he had cast the illness in the first place. Communities rarely tolerated repeated failure. A single tragedy could be explained away, but 2, 3, or 4 in quick succession, and suspicion hardened. The healer's hut turned into a courtroom. A cough outside the shaman's tent could sound like a jury gathering. What's striking is how often these accusations weren't about the supernatural at all. They were about frustration, grief, and the desperate need for answers. Who wants to accept that a baby died simply because it was too small to survive a winter storm? Far more satisfying to believe that someone misused power. Anger could be redirected toward a body, a name, a punishment. It gave chaos a villain and grief a script. And so the failed healer became a dangerous figure. His chants that once promised restoration began to sound like muttered curses. His odd silences looked like concealment. His herbal knowledge, once celebrated, was recast as dangerous tinkering. A cure delayed too long became indistinguishable from a slow-working poison. It was a cruel irony. The very attempt to save lives opened the door to accusations of taking them. Shamans stood at the boundary between the known and the unknown. But boundaries are fragile places. A few bad harvests, a string of sick children, and suddenly the healer's seat by the fire became a trial bench. And once suspicion began, it rarely ended with silence. Because if healing had failed, then surely the shaman was guilty of something worse, using power in ways the community feared to name aloud. The most dangerous thing about shamans wasn't their herbs or their drumming. It was the fact that no one could ever prove where their power began or ended. Was the chant that soothed the fever the same one that could spark it? Was the smoke curling from a ritual fire cleansing the air or filling it with poison? The line was blurry, and the people who lived beside shamans knew it. Among the Sami in northern Europe, the Noadi, their shamans were said to journey into the other world, bargaining with spirits for reindeer, fish, and safe passage through snowstorms. Helpful, yes. But if a storm did arrive, who else but the Noadi could have stirred it? In a world where survival hinged on fragile balances, the same knowledge that saved lives carried the suspicion of destroying them. Anthropologists often note that this ambiguity wasn't a side effect of shamanism, it was the point. Power had to be mysterious to be effective. Nobody feared a healer who could only offer aspirin-level certainty. The performance, the trance, the spectacle, all of it, worked precisely because people weren't sure if the shaman was in control or possessed by something bigger. And ambiguity breeds suspicion. That suspicion was woven into language itself. In many traditions, the words for healer and sorcerer were almost identical, separated only by context. In Nahua, culture of central Mexico, for instance, the tissitl could be a doctor or a sorcerer, depending on whether their treatment succeeded. In East Africa, the same diviner who diagnosed illness could be accused of causing it. A blessing was only a curse in reverse. This duality was also political. Leaders relied on shamans to sanctify authority, to make alliances feel cosmically approved. But when alliances fractured, those same shamans became convenient scapegoats. Nothing says explain away my failed war quite like blaming the court diviner for whispering with unfriendly spirits. And people noticed. A shaman who thrived too much, who grew rich off gifts, who claimed too many successes risked envy. The community began to ask why his good fortune didn't spread more evenly. A goat that died after grazing in his pasture was suddenly suspicious. A rival's child who wasted away in fever was evidence enough. That thin line between respect and fear collapsed the moment balance tipped. The irony was exquisite. The shaman's authority rested entirely on being seen as powerful, but the more powerful they appeared, the more threatening they became. The very skills that made them indispensable also made them the easiest target when misfortune came sniffing around. It left communities in a constant state of uneasy calculation. Love your shaman enough to keep them close, but never so much that they couldn't be accused when things turned ugly. And when things did turn ugly, the accusations rarely came from strangers. They started with those who knew the shaman best, the ones who had been waiting for a crack in the mask. And once rivals entered the stage, that blurred line became a weapon, sharpened not by spirits, but by jealousy. If shamanic power was always walking a tightrope, then rivals were the ones waiting below, grinning, ready to yank the rope. Accusations rarely fell out of the sky. They were planted, watered, and carefully tended by those who stood to gain the most if a shaman's reputation slipped. In Siberia, competing shamans often staged duels, not with spears or knives, but with chants, spirit journeys, and trance battles. The community would watch as one claimed to send illness into the other. while the second countered by spitting out feathers or pebbles as proof of victory. Entertaining, yes, but risky, because a shaman who stumbled or collapsed in the middle of performance was suddenly more than just unlucky. He was defeated, exposed, maybe even dangerous, and rivals didn't let that moment go to waste. Power was fragile, and rivalry was everywhere. In South America, among the Shipibo-Canibo, accusations of dark sorcery were often leveled during feuds between healers. A shaman whose apprentice outshone him might find himself accused of feeding curses instead of cures. Among the Navajo, too, witchcraft was often framed as a tool of jealous practitioners who wanted to undercut each other's standing. No spirit world intervention required, just ordinary human envy dressed in feathers and smoke. These rivalries thrived in communities where survival meant competition, who had more patience, who received more gifts of food, cloth, or cattle, whose rituals seemed to work better. Success painted a target on one's back, and failure gave rivals the opening to twist the knife. Shamans were supposed to be above petty quarrels, yet the quarrels dragged them down like anyone else, and the accusations weren't just whispered, they were staged. Rival shamans might discover hidden charms in each other's huts, bones tied with string, little dolls pierced with thorns, scraps of hair tucked into jars. The evidence was as performative as the healing, but no less convincing to a crowd already half convinced. Theatrics mattered. Once an audience gasped, guilt was halfway established. The absurdity lay in how often these charges were transparently set. A rival healer denounced another for dark magic, then conveniently absorbed his patience, his gifts, and his prestige. Communities might suspect the politics at play, but suspicion only needed a spark, and envy had tinder to spare. Anthropologists note this pattern across continents. Accusations of sorcery were almost always tied to tension, land disputes, family quarrels, or rivalries over influence. The shaman's crime was rarely that he had spoken with spirits. It was that he had spoken with the wrong ones, at the wrong time, in a way that made someone else look smaller. But once rivals began to whisper, the community had to respond. Was misfortune the fault of bad weather, or of a jealous healer? Did sickness spread because of contaminated water, or because someone muttered the wrong chant at midnight? And if rivals could frame suspicion, leaders could weaponize it. Because nothing pleased a chief quite like redirecting blame from his own failings onto a conveniently accused shaman. If rivals sharpened their knives in private, leaders sharpened theirs in public. Chiefs, kings, and headmen had a complicated relationship with shamans. They needed them, they feared them, and when politics soured, they crushed them. Across Central Asia, Khans relied on shamans to sanctify their rule. A ruler who commanded armies was only half a ruler. He needed someone to claim the spirits approved, but the bond was conditional. If victories stalled or famine spread, the same shaman who once crowned the leader with legitimacy could be recast as the saboteur. Better to blame the healer than admit the gods weren't returning the ruler's calls. History has examples dripping with irony. In the Congo Kingdom, Portuguese missionaries reported that local rulers alternately praised and punished diviners. A diviner who correctly identified a thief one week might, by the next, be accused of conspiring with witches if political alliances shifted. The evidence didn't need to change, only the balance of power did. Even closer to Europe's borders, the Sami Noadi faced similar danger under expanding Scandinavian kingdoms. A Noadi whose prophecies aligned with royal interests was tolerated. A Noadi who resisted, say, by predicting failure in Christian wars, was labeled not merely misguided, but dangerously demonic. It's funny how quickly respected intermediary with the spirit world became enemy of order once royal patience ran thin. The same happened in Amazonian societies, where chiefs and shamans often shared a stage of influence. But chiefs dealt in visible power alliances, food distribution, war decisions, while shamans dealt in invisible power. And invisible power is slippery. When the chief wanted to silence dissent, accusing a shaman of dark magic was remarkably convenient. After all, how could the shaman disprove it? Spirits don't leave receipts. The tactic worked because the community wanted to believe it. In moments of crisis, people prefer a neat villain, and leaders were always happy to supply one. Accusations framed the ruler as protector, cleansing the village by eliminating the alleged sorcerer. It was justice with a political aftertaste, bitter for the accused, sweet for the throne. The great paradox was that shamans often helped create the very leaders who destroyed them. They blessed coronations, interpreted omens, and lent charisma a touch of sacred inevitability. But inevitability is a fragile mask. A bad harvest, a lost battle, or an epidemic tore holes in it. And the easiest way for a ruler to patch the damage was to sacrifice the one who had stitched the mask in the first place. And so, shamans lived in a permanent gamble. Their work elevated leaders, but it also gave those leaders a perfect scapegoat. They were necessary until they weren't. The crowd that once listened in reverence could, overnight, be gathered in the same square to hear accusations of demonic collusion, and leaders knew how to stage the fall. Rituals of punishment weren't just about silencing the shaman. They were theater, meant to show everyone else what happened if invisible power ever challenged visible authority. But before punishments came trials, and trials had their own grim theatrics, ceremonies designed less to find truth and more to humiliate, frighten, and confirm suspicion. Once a shaman was accused, the punishment didn't fall immediately. First came the theater of proving the crime. Because nothing reassures a frightened community like watching someone squirm under a ritual designed to look like justice but smell suspiciously like politics. In parts of West Africa, divination was often the chosen stage. The accused shaman might be forced into an ordeal with poisoned beans or chicken blood. If the concoction made him vomit, perhaps he was innocent. If it killed him, well, guilty or not, the spirits had spoken. Conveniently, the trial sorted itself out without appeals. Justice outsourced to digestion. Siberian shamans faced another kind of test. Rivals or elders might demand a spirit journey on the spot, with the community watching. If the shaman fell into convincing trance, perhaps he still had divine favor. If he stumbled or failed to produce visions, suspicion hardened into guilt. Imagine trying to perform a high-stakes, spiritual improv act, while knowing that missing a beat could mean exile. It wasn't so much a trial as a trap disguised as ritual. In the Andes, Spanish colonial records describe public ordeals where suspected sorcerers were interrogated with Christian prayers layered over indigenous practices. The accused had to navigate two worlds at once: the local cosmology that once legitimized him, and the imported system that now condemned him. Failure in either meant conviction. The Navajo had their own, subtler form. Accused witches were sometimes identified through a sing, a ceremonial performance where hidden guilt was expected to reveal itself. The beauty of such rituals, from the accuser's perspective, was that interpretation always leaned toward confirming suspicion. A cough, a hesitation, even sweat could be read as evidence. Spirit trials were less about truth than about confirming what everyone already wanted to believe. And of course, humiliation was key. Communities liked to see the accused stripped, not just of clothing, but of dignity. Being forced to confess publicly, often under pressure of beating or threat, gave the audience a sense of moral closure. The shaman's words, extracted under duress, became the proof everyone claimed to need. What makes these rituals chilling is how often they blurred performance and belief. People weren't simply cynically staging them. They genuinely thought spirits confirmed guilt through ordeal. And yet, the timing of accusations, always during crisis, rivalry, or political turmoil, reveals how convenient belief can be. The spirits never seemed to condemn a shaman when harvests were good or children were healthy. Anthropologists note how universal these proof rituals were. Across continents, trials of sorcery functioned less to discover facts than to dramatize collective fears. A community drowning in anxiety found relief by acting out its suspicion, and the shaman became the scapegoat. And once the ritual had spoken, there was no undoing it. A verdict was reached, guilt branded, punishment inevitable. The play was over, and the executioner stepped on stage, because trials were never the end. They were only the overture to what the crowd really came to see: the punishment, the purge, the spectacle of cleansing a community by breaking one of its own. After the ritual came the sentence, and this was the part everyone understood. Trials may have been dressed up in feathers, chants, or poisoned beans, but punishment was blunt and theatrical. Communities didn't whisper their justice, they staged it loudly, for everyone to watch, remember, and fear. Exile was the gentlest option, if one can call being thrown into the wilderness with no allies gentle. Among many Siberian groups, a shaman found guilty of using dark magic might be stripped of his drum and sent away. left to wander without community protection. A healer without patience is just another starving wanderer. The irony was brutal. The one who had guarded the village from spirits now had to face them alone. In other places, humiliation was the first step. Among some West African societies, a shaman accused of sorcery might be paraded through the village, mocked, spat on, and beaten lightly before more serious punishment followed. Public shaming wasn't an afterthought. It was the main event. People needed to see the fall. The louder the disgrace, the cleaner the supposed purification. Executions came too, and they often carried the flavor of ritual. In Amazonian groups, accused dark shamans could be strangled or speared in ceremonies meant to close the wound they had supposedly opened in the community. It wasn't random violence, it was choreographed, framed as restoring balance. But balance looks a lot like blood when you're standing too close. Even in the Arctic, where survival demanded every hand, punishment could be ruthless. The Sami Noadi sometimes faced drowning or beating, punishments performed in icy rivers, where the cold alone was lethal. The message wasn't just about silencing one dangerous figure. It was about reminding everyone that invisible power bowed to the authority of visible force. And still, some punishments stopped short of death, but aimed for erasure. Shamans could be denied burial rites, their names erased from stories, their graves left unmarked, so that descendants wouldn't inherit their stigma. It's one thing to kill a body, another to attempt to kill memory. Communities, in their zeal, often tried for both. What ties these punishments together is their performative weight. They weren't private reckonings. They were lessons staged in flesh and spirit. Children watched, elders watched, future shamans watched, and learned how thin the line was between being venerated and being vilified. There's a cruel practicality in it too. A shaman who frightened a chief, or rivaled another healer, or failed to stop a plague, could not simply disappear quietly. The act of punishment reassured the people that the danger was handled. It was less about ending the accused's life than about restoring the illusion that the community had regained control. And yet, for all the spectacle, the cycle never ended. Kill one shaman, and another would rise, because fear always found a new vessel. Communities that punished their healers discovered the paradox. You can't live without them, but you also can't fully trust them, which meant that long after the punishments were over, their memory lingered. Names became warnings, graves became avoided places, and stories carried the echo of fear. But memory has a way of distorting, twisting shame into legend, and soon, the punished shaman became more frightening dead than they ever were alive. Punishment ended the body, but memory did the real work. Communities didn't just kill shamans accused of dark magic, they embalmed them in suspicion, turning their names into warnings, their graves into boundaries, and their legacies into whispered lessons about what not to be. Among the Navajo, the label of Ontiutniatni, which was a stain that stretched beyond a lifetime. Even when the accused died, their family carried the shadow. Children grew up marked by the suspicion of their parents' darkness, as if blood itself could transmit guilt. Communities, practical as ever, understood that reputations were easier to bury than bodies. In Siberia, the grave of a condemned shaman wasn't visited with offerings like those of honored elders. Instead, it might be left deliberately untended, covered in stones, or placed outside communal burial grounds. People avoided it, wary of restless spirits. Ironically, this very avoidance often gave the grave a strange, magnetic power. The unvisited place became charged with stories, each retelling darker than the last. Colonial chronicles in the Andes recorded similar memories. Accused sorcerers had their descendants quietly excluded from ritual roles, their lineage considered unreliable. One accusation could stain generations, proving that the most effective punishment wasn't death, but the slow suffocation of a family's future. But memory is a mischievous thing. The further away the event slipped, the more distorted the story became. A failed healer who couldn't cure a fever became, in folklore, a dangerous witch who caused it. A woman accused for being too independent in life became a nocturnal spirit in death, feeding on children or wandering with animal companions. Communities punished shamans twice, once with exile or death, and once with legend. Sometimes, stigma mutated into power. The graves of accused shamans in Central Asia were said to attract secret visitors at night. People desperate enough to risk seeking help from a spirit that was both feared and forbidden. The condemned, erased in daylight, became powerful in darkness. You can exile a body, but you can't exile need. And yet, families remembered the shame. Descendants carried silences, refusing to speak the names of their accused ancestors. Lineages fractured under the weight of suspicion, some abandoning whole traditions of healing to avoid being tarred with the same brush. The community's need for safety destroyed its own inheritance. Anthropologists note how universal this forgetting through stigma was. Erasing names, branding families, fencing off graves. It wasn't just superstition, it was a way of policing collective memory, ensuring that one person's fall served as a perpetual example. The story of the punished shaman became the story of how fear was managed, but stigma has a half-life. Over centuries, whispers harden into myths, and myths into folklore. Villagers, once terrified of a supposed dark magician, might, generations later, tell stories of them as trickster figures or reluctant heroes. What began as condemnation morphed into entertainment, proving that history is less about what happened than about what people choose to keep. And so, the accused never really vanished. Their absence in ritual was filled by their presence in story, their erasure always incomplete. Communities that thought they had silenced danger instead wove it into their culture, ensuring the shaman lived on, feared, hated, but never fully gone. And once a memory had been twisted enough, people began to notice something else missing too. The gap left by the shaman's absence. Erasing a shaman wasn't just the end of a person, it was the quiet collapse of a system. The punishment of one healer, one diviner, one ritual specialist left communities exposed. Like a house with the roof torn off in midwinter. People wanted safety from dark magic, but what they actually created was a vacuum, and vacuums are dangerous things. Illnesses once managed by chants, herbs, and charms suddenly spread unchecked. The remedies might not have been perfect, but they had always been something, and something is vastly more reassuring than nothing. Among Amazonian groups, the killing of an accused dark shaman meant the loss of entire plant traditions. Since knowledge of which leaves healed burns, or which bark soothed fever was passed orally, often jealously guarded. Remove the shaman, and the cure vanished with them. The collapse wasn't just medical. Rituals that kept spirits at bay were disrupted. In Siberian villages, when shamans were exiled, people reported an increase in hauntings, nightmares, and bad omens. The fear that drove out the healer returned magnified, like a debt-collecting interest. The absence of the ritual drumbeat at ceremonies was a silence too loud to ignore. In West Africa, the exile or execution of a shaman often tipped the balance of political power. Rival leaders who had engineered the accusation found themselves burdened with the very responsibilities the shaman once carried. Healing disputes, negotiating with spirits, reading omens, all suddenly fell to chiefs who weren't equipped for it. It's one thing to orchestrate a rival's downfall. It's another to replace their role in the community. Even socially, gaps yawned open. Shamans had acted as mediators, absorbing communal tension by channeling it into ritual. Without them, conflicts between families grew sharper, rivalries harder to cool. Punishing the shaman didn't dissolve the village's problems, it only removed the pressure valve. Colonial encounters worsened this pattern. Missionaries in North America and Africa often encouraged accusations of witchcraft against shamans, framing them as devilish figures. Communities, robbed of their ritual specialists, became more dependent on foreign systems of medicine and belief. It wasn't just an erasure of individuals, but of entire cultural frameworks. Fear of dark magic turned out to be the perfect weapon for cultural displacement. But perhaps the sharpest wound was psychological. In Arctic communities, when Noadi were punished or drowned, survivors described feeling unmoored, cut off from the spirit world. The sense of safety that came from having someone who could interpret dreams, soothe restless souls, or bargain with storms was gone. People were left staring into the cold night sky, convinced the spirits were watching, and no one remained to answer back. Anthropologists sometimes describe these communities as entering ritual droughts, periods where ceremonies faltered, spiritual balance slipped, and collective morale withered. Fear may have justified the punishment, but it left behind a hole no one knew how to fill. And in that hole, suspicion festered. With one shaman gone, the next healer always worked under the threat of accusation. The cycle repeated itself. Trust the healer until something goes wrong. Then brand them as dangerous, punish them, and weaken the community further. It's a cycle that would only resolve, if it ever did, with the recognition of the paradox itself, that people couldn't survive without shamans, even if they couldn't fully trust them either. The irony of it all is that communities never stopped needing shamans, even as they punished them. It was the oldest paradox: fear and dependence, suspicion and reverence bound together in a knot no one could untie. A healer could become a witch with a single death in the wrong hut. Yet the same people who cast stones would later whisper for another shaman to cure their fevers, calm their dreams, or bless their harvests. This tension wasn't accidental, it was structural. Shamans lived at the edge of the village, literally and symbolically. They were liminal beings, half in society, half in the spirit world. It made them invaluable, but it also made them dangerous, because anything that crosses boundaries carries the scent of the unknown. People wanted their wisdom but feared their autonomy. Even the punishments revealed this paradox. Exile often ended with the community quietly sneaking back to consult the very person they had driven away. Execution didn't stop belief in the accused's power, it only reinforced it. The more violently a shaman was punished, the more convinced people became that their abilities were real. Dead shamans had a way of becoming even more terrifying than living ones. Anthropological records from Siberia, the Andes, and the Amazon repeat the same refrain. The absence of shamans never lasted long. Someone else always stepped into the role, because the need was too basic to ignore. The spirits weren't going to negotiate themselves, and illness wasn't going to heal out of courtesy. The cycle of suspicion and reliance restarted with each generation, as predictable as the seasons. Colonial history sharpened the paradox to a fine point. Missionaries painted shamans as servants of darkness, urging communities to abandon them. Yet even in the midst of conversion, people slipped away to consult their traditional healers in secret. They could confess on Sunday, but when their child burned with fever on Tuesday, it wasn't the priest they called for. And so, shamans survived, not in spite of persecution, but because of it. Fear never erased them. It only ensured they stayed hidden, more elusive, more liminal, which only deepened their mystique. The very suspicion that condemned them also preserved them, like fire tempering iron. The paradox rests in the human need for certainty in an uncertain world. Spirits, sickness, death, none of it could be controlled, but the shaman made it feel negotiable. Fear made the shaman suspect, but fear also made the shaman indispensable. Communities lived in that contradiction, never resolving it, never truly comfortable, but always circling back to it. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Shamans weren't destroyed by accusation, they were defined by it. Suspicion wasn't a side effect of their role, it was their role. They were meant to embody that fragile space between help and harm, cure and curse, trust and dread. To be both healer and threat was the essence of the job. So the story closes not with their elimination, but with their persistence. Shamans endured, precisely because they were never fully trusted. Communities punished them, feared them, remembered them, erased them, and then, inevitably, needed them again. The cycle didn't break. It couldn't. And that's the paradox still humming in the background of human history. The people who frightened us most were also the ones we couldn't live without.